King Sebastian I of Portugal was a young monarch with grand ambitions fueled by religious zeal. Ascending to the throne at just 3 years old in 1557, he grew up under the guidance of Jesuit tutors who instilled in him a fanatical sense of mission. As Sebastian came of age, he became convinced that he was destined to lead a crusade against the Muslim powers of North Africa and restore Christian rule there. This fervent belief in a sacred mission defined his reign. By his late teens, the king was impatient to prove himself on the battlefield and to expand Portugal's influence. He poured his energy into planning a military expedition to Morocco against the cautious advice of his older counselors. In 1578, King Sebastian launched his long-awaited campaign overseas, an adventure that would culminate in his mysterious disappearance and plunge Portugal into turmoil. Sebastian's crusading enterprise led to the Battle of the Three Kings on August 4th, 1578, a confrontation in northern Morocco that would decide his fate and that of the Portuguese Empire. The young king had allied with Mohammed II, a deposed Moroccan sultan who sought to reclaim his throne. In the summer of 1578, Sebastian landed in Morocco with a Portuguese-led invasion force of around 25,000 men, including Portuguese nobles, foreign mercenaries, and Moroccan allies. They marched inland under the blazing sun, determined to challenge the new Moroccan ruler, Sultan Abd al-Malik. On the plains near Qasr el-Kabir, the Portuguese coalition met a vastly superior Moroccan army. Portuguese planning and intelligence was extremely poor, and this battle was lost long before Sebastian and company made it to the battlefield. The Moroccan Sultan had received reinforcements from the powerful Ottoman Turks and was boasting a modern army with at least 60,000 men. When battle started, King Sebastian personally rode along his lines to rally his troops for the glory he envisioned. Despite initial confidence, the fight quickly turned against the Portuguese. Abd al-Malik, though gravely ill, led his forces from horseback, and the Moroccan army executed a bold plan to encircle the invaders. Early in the battle, a cannonball struck down one of Sebastian's key commanders, throwing the Portuguese center into confusion. Moroccan cavalry then surged around both flanks of Sebastian's army. After hours of fierce combat, the Portuguese lines crumbled under the pressure. The result was a catastrophic defeat. Thousands of Portuguese and their allies were slain, including nearly virtually all the entire high nobility of Portugal. It's estimated that the 15,000 survivors were taken captive and sold, mostly to work the galleys of the various Barbary pirates. Only a handful of Portuguese troops and their allies escaped the carnage. King Sebastian was last seen fighting valiantly amid his doomed troops, refusing to retreat even as the situation became hopeless. Amid the chaos and slaughter, the 24-year-old king vanished. His body was never conclusively identified on the field, leaving contemporaries uncertain whether he had perished or somehow survived the debacle. The Moroccan Sultan Abd al-Malik died during the battle, and Sebastian's ally drowned while fleeing. Notably, all three kings involved in the battle met their end that day. The battle's outcome was a disaster for Portugal, wiping out a generation of its leadership and ending Sebastian's ill-fated crusade in utter defeat. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, King Sebastian's fate became an enduring mystery. The most straightforward explanation is that he died in battle, as most of his men did. Indeed, given the overwhelming defeat and the fact that he was last seen surrounded by enemy forces, it's highly likely Sebastian was slain on the field. However, the failure to locate and positively identify his body gave rise to widespread speculation and hope that the young king might have somehow survived. In Portugal, a legend grew that Sebastian had escaped the battlefield, perhaps taken captive incognito or wandering in exile, and that he would one day return to his people. This messianic hope came to be known as Sebastianism. Sebastian's people, grief-stricken by the loss and facing an uncertain future, clung to the idea that their king would reappear in Portugal's darkest hour to save the nation. For years after 1578, rumors swirled of sightings and secret letters, all suggesting that Sebastian lived on in disguise. The belief in Sebastian's survival was so strong that it encouraged a series of false Sebastians to come forward in the decades after the battle. Between the 1580s and early 1600s, at least 4 different impostors declared themselves to be the missing monarch. These pretenders emerged in both Portugal and Spain, exploiting the popular longing for Sebastian's return. One particularly convincing false Sebastian was working as a baker in a Spanish town, when his colleagues noted that he could speak German and French, in addition to Spanish and Portuguese. Needless to say, it was a rarity for a simple baker to speak 4 languages at the time, and the stack of languages he spoke suggested he was from the high nobility. This baker, who was likely actually a Spanish man named Gabriel de Espinosa, was able to masquerade as Sebastian for a few months before the authorities ended his charade. Sebastian's disappearance had immediate and far-reaching consequences for Portugal. With the young king gone and no direct heir, the Portuguese monarchy faced a succession crisis. The king's elderly great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, assumed the throne. However, Henry was a celibate clergyman, and at nearly 70 years old, had no heirs of his own. He ruled for only 2 years, dying in 1580 and plunging Portugal further into a dynastic dispute. Backed by his powerful armies and a strong claim, Philip II of Spain invaded Portugal in 1580 to seize the throne. After defeating the remaining forces loyal to the Portuguese crown, Philip was proclaimed Philip I of Portugal in 1581, uniting the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. This began the period known as the Iberian Union, a dynastic union under the Spanish Habsburgs that lasted for 60 years. For Portugal, being absorbed into the Iberian Union marked the loss of the nation's independent sovereignty. Under Spanish rule, Portugal was governed by a foreign monarch, and although it retained formal autonomy in its laws and colonial administration, in practice the country became a junior partner. The consequences were significant. Portuguese colonies and trade were pulled into Spain's conflicts, and the once proud Portuguese navy and commerce suffered neglect. The disappearance of Sebastian thus inadvertently led to a decline in Portugal's standing and the end of its golden age of exploration and prosperity. In 1640, the Portuguese finally revolted and restored independence under the House of Braganza, ending the Iberian Union. However, the legacy of Sebastian's ill-fated crusade had already completely reshaped the course of Portuguese history. He had sought to win glory for his kingdom, but instead, his loss brought about a period of crisis and subjugation. Cambyses II was the second ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the eldest son of the famous conqueror Cyrus the Great. He ascended the throne around 530 BC and, much like his father, pursued aggressive military expansion. His most notable campaign was the conquest of Egypt in 525 BC, defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium and bringing the ancient land of the Nile under Persian rule. As the new ruler of Egypt, Cambyses II also took on the title of Pharaoh. But his ambitions didn't stop at the Nile. While in Egypt, he planned further campaigns to Ethiopia and Carthage. However, neither of these plans materialized. However, most importantly for this story, he also sought to conquer the Siwa Oasis in the Western Desert. The Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis was famous in the ancient world. Even Alexander the Great would later visit it. According to historical accounts, Cambyses II was angered or threatened by this oracle. In 524 BC, after capturing Egypt, he dispatched a detachment of about 50,000 Persian soldiers into the Western Desert, with orders to march on Siwa Oasis. This was essentially a punitive expedition against the priests of Amun, who were viewed as being unfavorable to Persian rule. Somewhere along the way, they vanished. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that the force made it as far as the oasis of Karga, about halfway to Siwa, then met a terrible fate. In Cambyses' lifetime, no trace of the detachment was ever found. It simply never arrived at Siwa nor ever returned. This shocking disappearance of an entire army in the desert became a lingering worry for Cambyses II, who himself died a few years later under murky circumstances. Ancient writers like Herodotus provide the only detailed account of the lost army, and his dramatic story has captivated imaginations for well over 2 millennia. According to Herodotus's 5th century BC narrative, the Persian troops were swallowed by the desert, simply engulfed by a sudden sandstorm that buried all 50,000 men alive. Ever since, this tale has persisted as one of antiquity's greatest mysteries. How could an entire army simply vanish without a trace? The story has a tantalizing mix of elements: an ambitious king, a cursed mission against a sacred oracle, and the deadly forces of nature in the Sahara. The lost army remained a historical artifact that wasn't seriously investigated until the 19th century. Since then, its existence remains an archaeological holy grail, a puzzle that could confirm or refute an ancient historical account. Part of what keeps the mystery alive is the sheer scale of the event and the lack of concrete evidence. 50,000 men, if that number is accurate, would leave behind a lot of bones, weapons, and artifacts. Yet no definitive discovery has ever been confirmed. This absence of evidence has led many scholars to question the story. Some Egyptologists suspect the tale may be exaggerated or even fully apocryphal. Over the years, historians and scientists have proposed several explanations for what really happened to Cambyses' army, if it existed at all. The traditional explanation is the one given by Herodotus, a natural disaster. In this view, the army was simply overcome by the harsh desert environment. A sudden sandstorm, not uncommon in the Sahara, could indeed be deadly. Fierce desert winds can create a wall of sand type effect that could disorient anyone caught in the open. If such a storm lasted long enough, it might bury bodies and equipment in sand, erasing visible traces. Some scholars find this plausible, noting that the western desert's Great Sand Sea is known for massive dunes and extreme weather. However, others point out that it's unlikely for a sandstorm alone to eliminate every last man. If the story were true, some survivors would have presumably straggled out. It's also possible the soldiers succumbed to a combination of factors: extreme heat, thirst, and disorientation in the uncharted desert. Losing their way, they might have perished from dehydration and exposure, with the desert winds gradually covering their remains over time. Another popular theory, briefly touched upon earlier, is that the story was a myth or misreported history. Skeptics note that Herodotus wrote his account decades after the event and got his information secondhand, supposedly from Egyptian sources in Siwa. It's conceivable that no Persian army was actually lost in a sandstorm as described. Instead, the truth might have been less spectacular. For instance, the force could have been turned back by a sandstorm, and later generations turned it into a legend of divine punishment by the gods of the desert. Some historians argue that Herodotus, who loved a good tale to put it mildly, may have embellished the story in the extreme. After all, it seems highly unlikely that the Persians would have dispatched an extremely large force to conquer this oasis. First of all, it was a relatively small population center to begin with, and 50,000 men would have been an unreasonable allocation of resources. To put this in perspective, today the Siwa oasis only has a population of 25,000 people. But perhaps most importantly, is the issue of supplying 50,000 troops on a march through the eastern Sahara Desert. This would be an extremely difficult task in modern times, with modern logistics, let alone in ancient times. If this lost army was based on a real event, it seems like the number may have been exaggerated by as much as 1 or even 2 orders of magnitude. The lack of corroborating records in Persian or Egyptian about this mass death is extremely suspicious as well. If Cambyses truly lost such a large part of his army, one might expect Persian chronicles or Egyptian inscriptions to mention it, yet we have none. Notably, some modern historians suspect that the lost army may have been a myth conjured up by the Persians themselves to cover up for a loss in battle. There's some evidence that Egyptian loyalists under Petubastis III scored a significant victory against the Persians around the time when the lost army event supposedly occurred. In favor of this, Petubastis III seized the moment to retake parts of Egypt, even crowning himself pharaoh in Memphis, before the Persians could respond. 2 years later, Cambyses' successor Darius I reconquered the area and crushed the rebellion. Adventurers and archaeologists have mounted expeditions into the Egyptian desert specifically to find traces of the Persian force. In the 1930s, numerous European expeditions attempted to find any hint of the army, but turned up empty-handed. In the 1980s, more systematic searches were conducted using aircraft and basic ground-penetrating radar. Notably, some suspicious bone fragments were discovered, but they were later dated to 1500 BC, ruling them out. In recent years, modern satellite imagery and remote sensing have been applied in hopes of spotting unusual shapes under the sand, but nothing conclusive has surfaced as yet. Despite all efforts, no unequivocal physical evidence of Cambyses' 50,000 soldiers has ever been verified, and whether the story itself is true or not remains a mystery. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Now let's get back to business. Rongo Rongo is an undeciphered system of glyphs from Easter Island, also called Rapa Nui. Discovered by outsiders in the 19th century, these symbols were carved on wooden objects and appear to represent a form of writing. European missionaries first reported the script in the 1860s. In 1864, a priest noticed wooden tablets covered with hieroglyphs, or some writing system in the houses of Easter Islanders. Notably, at this time, he reported that some of the locals were aware of the meaning of the script. A few years later, in 1868, a priest in Tahiti received a couple of these inscribed tablets from Rapa Nui converts, sparking new interest. By then, however, the island's population had been devastated by raids and disease, and reportedly no one was left who could still read the glyphs. Many tablets were lost or destroyed during this turbulent period. In the aftermath, about 24 wooden objects with Rongo Rongo inscriptions were eventually collected and sent to museums. According to later Rapa Nui oral tradition, only a select elite of priests and wise men could read this script, and that knowledge died with them along with the raids and disease. Rongo Rongo's significance is potentially highly profound. If it truly encodes language, it represents a unique instance of a writing system invented in complete and total isolation. Scholars have observed that Rongo Rongo shares no obvious similarities with any other form of writing. It may have been devised entirely by the Rapa Nui people, representing an independent invention of writing that would make it one of the very few in human history. A recent study even found that one wooden tablet dates to the 15th century, evidence that the script predates European or any known outside influence on the island. Yet Rongo Rongo's isolation also makes it hard to decipher. There are no bilingual inscriptions or translations to use as a key, and the body of texts is extremely limited, about 15,000 glyphs in total. The underlying language of the texts is assumed to be an old form of Rapa Nui, but by the late 19th century, the spoken Rapa Nui language had changed under outside influences. Some researchers have even wondered if Rongo Rongo is actually a full writing system, or more of a device used to memorize chants. Under this theory, the glyphs are less hieroglyphic in nature, and more mnemonic devices that were used by elders for the purposes of ceremonies. Despite the difficulties, many people have tried to crack the Rongo Rongo code. Early attempts involved working with the last native individuals who might have known it. In the 1860s, a local bishop attempted to have an islander named Matoro chant several tablets aloud. Matoro's recitations were inconsistent, and many readings weren't reproducible. The bishop suspected that Matoro either misunderstood how to read the script or was intentionally holding back. Many have speculated that Matoro may not have wanted to provide proper chants and translations to a Christian authority figure for fear of seizure or even destruction of the materials. After all, missionaries were in the process of actively and aggressively converting the island, and memories of the old ways may not have been congruent with this. In 1886, an islander named Urivai Iko provided another tantalizing clue. He had been a servant to the last Rapa Nui king, who he said knew Rongo Rongo. Notably, Uri didn't claim to be literate in the language himself, but claimed that he was able to recall the content of some of the inscriptions from memory. He was asked to chant from one of the tablets in the Rapa Nui language. What he recited turned out to be a traditional Rapa Nui creation chant, discussing the order of the creation of the world. Notably, this also gives credence to the theory that Matoro may have intentionally obfuscated the content of the Rongo Rongo items when he was talking to the bishop in the 1860s. However, Uri was recalling an oral text from memory, and researchers could not confidently match his words to specific glyphs on the tablets. These early Rapa Nui informants hinted that the Rongo Rongo texts might be ceremonial or mythological in nature, but they didn't reveal the actual mechanism of the writing. Legitimate academic interest in Rongo Rongo didn't pick up until the mid-20th century. Modern scholarly efforts began in the mid-20th century. In 1958, a German scholar, Thomas Barthel, identified a sequence of about 30 glyphs on one tablet as a lunar calendar. According to him, the glyphs in that sequence appear to correspond to lunar cycles. This was a breakthrough in understanding at least the subject of that text. Even so, while scholars agree this sequence is a calendar, they still can't actually read it in terms of language. Rather, they simply know what it represents. Numerous other scholars and amateur code crackers have taken a shot at Rongo Rongo, but at present only Thomas Barthel's findings have been universally accepted. If Rongo Rongo is truly a system for writing Rapa Nui, it represents one of the few times in human history writing has ever been independently invented, and the only time in complete isolation. Also, just as a quick aside, I just realized I spent this entire time talking about Easter Island, without mentioning Moai statues. Now, not to toot my own horn here, but I feel like that might be some sort of record. In the hills of Appalachia lurks a mystery older than the United States itself, an enigmatic group known as the Moon-Eyed People. According to Cherokee folklore, these peculiar beings inhabited the Appalachian Mountains long before Europeans set foot on the continent. They've been described as pale-skinned nocturnal humans who live underground and who have eyes so sensitive they couldn't bear daylight. But who were they really? Theories vary from ancient Welsh explorers, a forgotten indigenous civilization, to more esoteric claims. The legend of the Moon-Eyed People first emerged through Cherokee oral tradition and reached early settler ears by the 18th century. One of the earliest written accounts dates to 1797, when Benjamin Smith Barton, a scientist, attempted to document these oral traditions. He reported an unusual Cherokee story describing a strange people already living in the area when they arrived. These moon-eyed inhabitants, unable to see clearly by day, were eventually driven away by the Cherokee, who claimed their land. Another striking account came from Cherokee Chief Oconostota, documented by Tennessee's first governor, John Sevier, in 1782. Now, notably, I should mention that John Sevier generally had hostile relations with the Cherokee and led troops in numerous battles against Cherokee forces. That is to say, he may have been an unreliable narrator, and he may have had alternative reasons for attributing the following to this Cherokee chief. Oconostota vividly described mysterious quote-unquote white people who crossed the ocean long before Europeans officially arrived, leaving behind impressive stone structures. According to this narrative, the Cherokee strategically ambushed the Moon-Eyed people during a bright full moon when they couldn't properly see, and eliminated them. Modern theorists have suggested that this early recording of this oral tradition may have been twisted to suit the needs of those who wished to conquer the Cherokee and take their land. Evidence for this is circumstantial. However, it portrays the Cherokee as people who conquered the land from people who sound like they could conceivably be European descendants. Accordingly, this may have been used to shore up the idea that the land wasn't rightfully property of the Cherokee. This effectively reframes the narrative of conquest into the much more palatable idea of a reconquest of rightful lands. Over centuries, speculation about the Moon-Eyed people's identity has inspired a variety of theories. The most interesting theory points to medieval Welsh explorers led by Prince Madoc, who allegedly sailed to America around 1170, centuries before Columbus. Legends persist of blue-eyed Native Americans speaking an unintelligible tongue, fueling claims that the Moon-Eyed people were descendants of these lost colonists. At Georgia's Fort Mountain State Park, a plaque proudly attributes an ancient stone wall to Madoc's followers. To some, this has cemented the Welsh narrative, despite the lack of solid archaeological evidence. Others have speculated they're the descendants of Norse colonists from Vinland or Greenland. Despite the Norse actually having been in America prior to Columbus, this theory hasn't attracted much attention. A more historically grounded theory suggests the Moon-Eyed people were remnants of earlier indigenous cultures, such as the Adena or Hopewell mound builders. Cherokee stories might reflect real memories of encountering ancient civilizations that had previously inhabited Appalachia, constructing mounds and stone forts. Over generations, these encounters evolved into mythic tales of fair-skinned predecessors. Some have speculated that this element, where the Moon-Eyed people are described as looking vaguely European, developed after their arrival on the continent. Interestingly, according to this theory, the Cherokee may have heard about Europeans long prior to actually meeting any, and worked their appearance into a pre-existing myth. Another theory is that the Cherokee references to Moon-Eyed people described early European miners, quote-unquote, living underground and emerging primarily at night. And when you think about it for a moment, it actually makes a lot of sense. Seeing hunched-over people with unfamiliar hair, eye and skin colors emerging from the ground at dusk may have been the genesis of this legend. These individuals would have also needed some time to adjust to normal light after a day down in the mine, contributing to the idea that their eyes couldn't handle natural light. Socrates of Athens is one of history's most famous philosophers, yet a debate persists over whether he was a real individual, a literary device, or something in between. To tip my hand a bit, by the end of this portion of the video, you'll at least appreciate my position as to why Socrates was definitely both a real person and a literary device. Unlike other prominent ancient Greek thinkers, Socrates wrote nothing himself. Everything we know of his life and ideas comes secondhand from the works of others, chiefly his students Plato and Xenophon, and the playwright Aristophanes, who satirized him. This lack of direct writings has led some to wonder if Socrates was merely a character created by Aristophanes and taken up by other writers. The majority of scholars firmly believe that Socrates was a genuine historical figure, not a fictional character, and let me show you why. However, somewhat paradoxically, this doesn't really answer the question as to whether Socrates was a literary device or not. The evidence for his existence is substantial. Multiple contemporary sources from the 5th century BC in Athens refer to Socrates as a well-known citizen, and their reports on him have a great degree of commonalities. Plato, Socrates' most famous student, makes Socrates the central character in almost all of his philosophical dialogues. Plato's works Apology, Crito, Phaedo, Symposium, and many others depict Socrates conversing in Athens on ethics, justice, and knowledge. These dialogues include many realistic details of Athenian society, suggesting Plato was writing about a real mentor he knew in youth. Further, these writings included references to real Athenians who would have had real memories of their interactions with Socrates. Since Plato was distributing his works for an Athenian audience, fabricating stories about controversial conversations that took place could have landed Plato in hot water, so to speak. Xenophon, a soldier and historian, also knew Socrates and wrote his own memorabilia and apology of Socrates. His writings recollect Socrates' conversations and character from a more practical viewpoint. The playwright Aristophanes features a character named Socrates in his comedy The Clouds, first performed in 423, while Socrates was alive. This timeline is very important because Plato and Xenophon, both who claimed to have known Socrates, were just children then. Aristophanes also references Socrates in at least 2 other plays, called The Birds and the Frogs. Historians agree that it's highly unlikely Aristophanes would satirize a non-existent person in front of an Athenian audience that included Socrates' contemporaries. Beyond these 3 major sources, at least 4 other comic poets of the time poked fun at Socrates in fragments of their plays. Further, records of Athenian orators indicate that he was mentioned in contemporary speeches. Even Plato's student Aristotle, born 15 years after Socrates' death, refers to Socrates in his writings. Notably, Aristotle distinguished Socrates' ideas from Plato's innovations, though I'll come back to that in a moment. Such widespread mention across different authors is extremely strong proof of Socrates' historical existence, beyond what we have for most historical figures of the era. Despite this, a minority of scholars do still maintain that there's a chance he was just a well-established literary device that everyone took to mentioning. All the historical accounts consistently place Socrates in 5th century Athens, interacting with well-known figures. They describe common biographical details for the man. Socrates was the son of a stonemason, served as a hoplite in the Peloponnesian War, and later faced trial and execution in 399 on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. Even small details of Socrates' personality are well known. For instance, all the sources universally agree that he was physically strong and robust, despite his intellectual bent. Notably, Socrates' trial is reported by both Plato and Xenophon as a matter of historical record. This famous event, Socrates being sentenced to drink hemlock poison by the Athenian court, couldn't have been invented wholesale without contemporary Athenians objecting. While this could theoretically be referencing the fictional trial of a literary character, the overwhelming evidence suggests otherwise. Of all our sources, Plato provides the most extensive and well-known portrayals of Socrates. Plato was about 20 years old when he became a follower of Socrates, and he knew him until Socrates' passing. In a series of dialogues written over Plato's lifetime, Socrates appears as a conversational protagonist, engaging in philosophical debates on a wide range of topics. Plato's writings have largely defined the legacy of Socrates, but they also blur the line between the historical Socrates and Plato's own philosophical ideas. Scholars have long noticed that the character Socrates is not portrayed exactly the same in all of Plato's works. In what are believed to be Plato's earlier dialogues, Socrates is depicted primarily as a questioner. He professes ignorance and focuses on dismantling others' claims in search of truth, famously asserting that he knows only that he knows nothing. These early accounts likely capture aspects of the real Socratic method, the way Socrates actually taught by probing others with questions rather than lecturing. This also potentially aligns with the satirical portrayal of him in Athenian society. Simply put, a lot of people likely found his method of inquiry extremely annoying, though not ineffective. However, in Plato's later dialogues, Socrates' role shifts. He delivers doctrines about metaphysics, politics, and ethics, which go far beyond the skeptical, question-only Socrates of the earlier dialogues. For example, in the Republic, Socrates describes a vision of a utopian society and its laws, a far cry from the Socrates who, in earlier conversations, claimed to have no wisdom of his own. This stark change has led many readers, including ancient ones like Aristotle, to suspect that in the later works, Plato was using Socrates as a mouthpiece for Plato's own philosophical theories. Aristotle, who didn't meet Socrates, explicitly attributes many doctrines Plato put in Socrates' mouth to Plato, not to Socrates, indicating that such ideas were not part of Socrates' original teaching. Also, importantly, Aristotle, in his writings, referred to, quote, the Socrates, which is believed to refer to the actual historical Socrates described in Plato's early writings. When Aristotle is referring to Socrates as a mouthpiece for Plato's personal ideas, he simply refers to him as Socrates, meaning the likely fictionalized version Plato used later. Another window into Socrates' life comes from Xenophon, an Athenian soldier and historian who was also acquainted with the philosopher. Xenophon's depiction of Socrates, however, is quite different from Plato's. Where Plato's Socrates is a probing thinker concerned with abstract virtues, Xenophon's Socrates is a much more practical and even homespun figure. Xenophon met Socrates as a young man, though likely not as early or as often as Plato did. Nevertheless, Xenophon clearly admired Socrates and wrote several works about him. In these writings, Xenophon presents Socrates as a wise, moral, and practical advisor. He often highlights Socrates' common sense teachings and ethical guidance. For example, Xenophon's Socrates gives concrete advice on topics like managing one's estate and saving money. These are subjects that never appear in Plato's dialogues. This suggests that Xenophon, a farmer and soldier, was inclined to emphasize down-to-earth matters. Xenophon's background as a historian led some early scholars to trust his account of Socrates more than Plato's. Since Xenophon wasn't constructing complex philosophical arguments, it was assumed he might be reporting Socrates' life more straightforwardly. However, modern scholarship is divided on Xenophon's reliability. On one hand, Xenophon writes in a plain, matter-of-fact style and had no obvious philosophical agenda, so he might preserve a genuine side of Socrates that Plato glossed over. On the other hand, Xenophon appears to have no meaningful interest in philosophy, beyond appreciating Socrates as a wise mentor. Xenophon, therefore, clearly also doesn't capture the full breadth of who Socrates was as a thinker. The third key source is Aristophanes, who provides a completely different perspective from the stance of both comedy and social satire. Aristophanes was an older contemporary of Socrates, and the only source to portray Socrates while he was still alive and in the middle of his career. Aristophanes staged the clouds, a comedy that lampooned Socrates as a leading figure of newfangled intellectualism in Athens. In The Clouds, Aristophanes portrays Socrates as a ridiculous sophist, essentially a professional crap disturber who runs a pseudo-school called the Thinkery. The character Socrates is depicted as hanging in a basket, literally up in the air, babbling about nonsense. He teaches young men frivolous and unethical lessons. For instance, he's noted to be teaching them how to make a weaker argument defeat the stronger argument through clever wordplay, and how to avoid paying debts through rhetoric. He also performs absurd natural experiments like measuring how far a flea can jump. This comedic caricature is likely exaggerated for comic effect, but for the satire to actually work, it can't have been a totally off-base characterization of Socrates. And given that he was sentenced to drink hemlock for corrupting the youth about 2.5 decades later, there's good reason to think the play had a strong basis in truth. That said, some scholars have suggested that the Socrates presented is an amalgamation of a number of popular philosophers from the period into a single character. Under this theory, Socrates was likely chosen to be the representative figure simply because he had the most interesting personality of them all. Piecing together the real Socrates from these divergent portrayals is challenging, but not impossible, since these accounts contain some commonalities. All sources agree Socrates attracted the attention of Athens' youth and conversed widely. To put it simply, the real Socrates was almost certainly a very charismatic man who strongly threatened the existing social order. He encouraged the youth to question everything they were taught by his elders, which ended up being the death of him, quite literally. Socrates was almost certainly considered eccentric by Athenian standards. The sources concur that he paid little attention to material wealth, appearance, or political ambition. He often strolled around barefoot, wearing shabby clothes, despite being quite well off. So that brings us back to the initial question: where do we stand on who Socrates actually was, and was he an actual person? All evidence points to the fact that Socrates was almost certainly a very real and prominent citizen that inhabited 5th century Athens. Yet, the real Socrates behind the texts remains elusive, with all our available sources filtering them through their respective understandings of the man. Personally, I trust Xenophon's account most of all, since he didn't have much of an agenda beyond portraying someone he admired in a good light. On the other hand, many of Plato's accounts of Socrates appear to be simply adding him as a literary device to give more weight to an idea Plato likes. Aristophanes' account serves a different, yet important purpose. He provides important corroborating evidence to confirm that Socrates was a well-known Athenian figure. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my alternative channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Now let's get back to business. Late on February 28, 1986, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme left a Stockholm movie theater with his wife Lisbeth after a spontaneous night out with their son and his girlfriend. Palme had no security detail with him. He had declined a bodyguard that evening, which was not unusual for his private outings. As the couple walked home, a man came up behind them and fired 2 shots at close range. One bullet struck Palme in the back, fatally severing his carotid artery, and the second narrowly missed Lisbeth. Bystanders rushed to help as the perpetrator fled into the darkness. An ambulance brought Palme to the hospital, but just after midnight he was pronounced dead. The shocking slaying of a national leader on a public street left Sweden in disbelief and immediately raised the urgent question of who was responsible and why. Olof Palme was not a typical head of government. He was a charismatic social democratic leader and an outspoken internationalist who had led Sweden on and off since the 1960s. Palme's candid criticism of the regime in South Africa and his anti-colonial views earned him as many enemies as admirers. At home and abroad, conservatives reviled him, and some even spread rumors he was a secret KGB agent, while others hailed him as a champion of human rights. This divisiveness meant there was no shortage of potential foes. The immediate police response to Palma's attack was plagued by mistakes that would haunt the case. Crucially, officers failed to promptly seal off the crime scene, allowing bystanders to walk through and possibly destroy evidence. Communication breakdowns added to the chaos. For example, an early emergency call about the act was misdirected and never reached police in time. Other basic failures have been noted in the aftermath of the event. For instance, in the critical first hours, the perimeter around the area of the attack wasn't closed, and roadblocks along major arteries were extremely slow to roll out. As days turned to weeks, public confidence in the investigation waned. Under intense pressure to solve the crime, authorities poured seemingly unlimited resources into the hunt. Yet the investigation, led for a time by Stockholm Police Chief Hans Holmer, became chaotic, focusing on flashy but unproductive tactics while overlooking basic police work. For instance, Holmer held frequent press conferences of questionable value and even deployed military fighter jets to scour the city for the weapon. And no, you don't have to replay that part. Fighter jets were out there looking for a figurative needle in a haystack. You would think if they wanted to deploy some air power for this investigation, helicopters would be a more sensible choice than fighter jets. But hey, that's just my view. Meanwhile, more routine police work suffered. One veteran journalist noted that officers messed up routine tasks and failed to properly follow up on critical evidence in the early days. Perhaps the biggest blow to the case came in 1989, when prosecutors did manage to convict a suspect, only to have the verdict overturned due to serious police errors. One of the earliest and most persistent theories is that Palma was slain by a lone individual acting independently, rather than as part of a wider effort. The chief embodiment of this theory is Christer Peterson, a petty criminal who became the prime suspect in the late 1980s. Peterson was a local substance user and alcoholic with a history of extreme violence. And I'm not exaggerating here when I say extreme violence. He had already been in prison once for ending another life. In December 1988, nearly 3 years after the slaying, police arrested him after Palma's widow picked him out of a lineup as the man who committed the act. The following year, Peterson was convicted of the crime, seemingly providing closure to the case. However, the conviction was soon overturned by a higher court. The appeals court ruled that the evidence was insufficient and unreliable. Investigators had never produced the alleged weapon, and Peterson's motive for attacking Palma was unclear, but these were comparatively minor issues. Crucially, police had mishandled the lineup by tipping off Lisbeth Palma that the suspect had a severe drinking problem. Notably, Peterson appeared extremely disheveled while all the other men were well put together in comparison. She chose Peterson explicitly on the basis that he was the one who appeared to have a drinking problem and not entirely based on her own recollection. Notably, after being acquitted, Peterson reportedly boasted to his friends that he actually committed the crime. However, there's no evidence to suggest he did, and all evidence suggests that he was simply an extremely violent individual with a loose connection to reality. Another version of the lone wolf theory gained traction in recent years, focusing on a man who was at the scene but long overlooked as a suspect. Stig Engström was among the bystanders on the scene, and he built up something of a media profile in the years following the event. Engström openly disliked Palma's left-leaning politics and had significant weapons training from his military service. Decades after the crime, journalists and investigators pieced together inconsistencies in Engström's story. Multiple witnesses had described a man fleeing the scene who strongly resembled Engström, yet Engstrom himself claimed he stayed and tried to help. He gave statements about his movements that night which did not match known timelines, and he seemed oddly eager to insert himself into the media narrative of the crime. In a dramatic press conference 34 years after Palma's death, the chief prosecutor named Stig Engstrom as the prime suspect and formally closed the investigation. The only reason the case was closed is that Stig had passed away in the year 2000. Officials conceded that there was no direct evidence tying him to the act, but they argued that the accumulated clues pointed to Engstrom and no other suspect. This announcement was met with mixed reactions. While some observers felt the mystery had at last been solved, others criticized the conclusion as speculative and unfulfilling. In viewing the evidence, I understand why so many in Sweden were left empty with this announcement. There was no hard evidence whatsoever indicating he actually did it. It looks as though he could have been an individual who just wanted to insert himself into a high-profile police investigation. Anyway, I'll come back to this in a moment, after I discuss some of the other theories of the case. Another leading theory stretches far beyond Sweden's borders, pointing the finger at the South African Intelligence Service. Stunning allegations to this effect emerged in 1996, when a former South African police officer testified in court that his country's security forces were behind Palma's attack. He named a variety of known South African spies and mercenaries as being in on the job. Olof Palme was a vocal opponent of South Africa's regime. Just a week before his death, he had given a fiery speech condemning their system of governance and declaring it had to be abolished. Swedish investigators flew to South Africa to follow up on these leads. They interviewed witnesses and suspects, but ultimately found no evidence to substantiate any of the claims. The government had fallen by then, and no official records ever tied South African intelligence definitively to the crime. Despite the lack of evidence, a former head of Swedish intelligence went on the record indicating that forces within South African intelligence were his top suspects in the crime. Among the more disturbing theories are those that suggest the act was an inside job carried out or covered up by figures within Sweden's own police or security services. Given the errors in the investigation, some have wondered if malice, and not just incompetence, played a role in the failure to catch the perpetrator. This line of speculation usually points to Palma's domestic enemies. Palma had aroused intense hatred from certain circles in Sweden, including some elements within the police and military due to his liberal policies. Another theory suggests that, as improbable as it may sound, the entire event was simply a random act of violence. Notably, Palma was out and about without a security detail, and it's been suggested that the perpetrator may have simply targeted him at random. While this sounds improbable, it's technically a possibility as well. Almost 40 years later, the authorities are no closer to solving the events of February 28, 1986. Personally, I suspect that due to the police mishandling of the initial investigation, we'll never get a clear resolution to the case. The police announcing that Stig Engstrom was likely the perp, and then closing out the case, feels to me like an attempt at saving face by the Swedish police. I don't understand how they could say with such certainty that they had enough evidence to close the case based on the evidence they presented publicly. I suspect that if Stig were alive, there wouldn't have even been enough evidence to convict him based on the very weak circumstantial case presented. On April 21, 1918, Manfred von Richthofen, the famed Red Baron of Germany, with a record-breaking 80 aerial victories, took off in his bright red triplane, along with several squadron mates. The events of this day would spark a historical debate, which has continued on for more than a century. Over the Somme Valley in France, they engaged a patrol of British Royal Air Force Sopwith camels. During the dogfight, one camel piloted by Lieutenant Wilfred May broke away, and the Baron gave chase at low altitude deep into Allied territory. Roy Brown, a Canadian pilot flying a Sopwith camel, dived steeply from above to help his comrade. At the same time, Allied ground troops in the trenches below also opened fire with their machine guns and rifles as the low-flying red triplane passed over. Amid the bursts of gunfire from both Brown's aircraft and multiple Australian units on the ground, the Red Baron's luck finally ran out. His triplane abruptly descended and crash-landed in a field, ending the aerial ace, just a few days shy of his 26th birthday. The Red Baron had broken one of his own tactical rules by flying low and fast over enemy lines, a risky maneuver that put him within range of ground fire. His death was a significant propaganda coup for the Allies, but almost immediately a debate began. Who fired the bullet that ultimately felled history's most famous fighter ace? Captain Roy Brown of Canada was the pilot who engaged Manfred von Richthofen from the air, and he was officially credited with shooting down the Red Baron in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Brown reported that he dove on the red triplane from behind while it was targeting Lieutenant May, and he fired a long and consistent burst at close range. According to Brown's combat report, the triplane went into a steep dive and crashed after his attack. Lieutenant May later affirmed that he saw Richthofen's plane go down and was completely convinced that Brown must have been the one who hit the Baron. In recognition of Brown's daring interception of Richthofen, a formal RAF Board of Inquiry credited Brown with the victory. This, of course, made him an instant hero as the man who vanquished the Red Baron. Brown's claim went largely unquestioned by the RAF at the time, and he received much public acclaim. In fact, the British had strong motivation to credit an airman. Manfred von Richthofen had long been the most coveted target, and the RAF had even offered rewards and an automatic Victoria Cross to any pilot who could defeat him. Brown himself was modest about the achievement, but officially he went down in history as the victor over the Red Baron. However, from the very start, there were dissenting voices and conflicting eyewitness accounts that suggested Brown might not have fired the shot. Almost as soon as Richthofen's triplane hit the ground, Australian ground troops on the scene asserted that their fire had brought him down, not Roy Brown. Several machine gun posts of the Australian Imperial Force were stationed along Richthofen's flight path near Moreland Court Ridge, and they had engaged the low-flying red triplane. Multiple soldiers claimed credit, but through the years, only one has been found to have any serious claim. This claimant was Sergeant Cedric Popkin, an anti-aircraft Vickers machine gunner of the 24th Machine Gun Company, who fired at the triplane from the ground. Popkin later recounted that he fired 2 bursts at the Red Baron, first as it approached his position, and a second time as it banked and flew away, presenting its side and back to him. It was during this second burst, as von Richthofen began turning away, that Popkin likely scored a hit. In a letter to Australia's official war historian, Popkin described tracking the red plane through a 180-degree turn and firing at it until it rolled and crashed. The angle of Popkin's fire, from the Baron's right side and slightly to the rear, matches well with the wound the Baron sustained. Australian witnesses on the ground noted that the red triplane's flight became erratic after Popkin's bursts, veering and almost stalling before crash landing. They took this as evidence that ground fire had mortally wounded the pilot. Central to unraveling the mystery is the forensic evidence from von Richthofen's wounds and the trajectory of the bullet. Allied medical officers conducted an autopsy on the fallen airman on the day of his death. They found that von Richthofen had been slain by a single bullet, which entered under his right armpit and traveled upward through his chest cavity before exiting near the left side of his chest. Notably, the same sort of ammo was used by all Allied weaponry at play on that day, so the ammo itself doesn't solve the problem. But to get back to the main point, in other words, the shot came from below and to the right of the Baron, coursing upward through his body. This trajectory is a crucial clue. If Captain Roy Brown had struck the Red Baron while diving from above and behind in his Sopwith camel, the bullet path would be expected to travel downward into von Richthofen, not upward. Brown himself approached from the Baron's rear right at a higher altitude. It's difficult to reconcile Brown's attack angle with the wound's upward track, unless the Baron's plane was steeply banked at the exact moment Brown fired. Brown never mentioned such a steep bank in his combat report or later accounts. In fact, he described von Richthofen looking back at him during the chase, implying the triplane was roughly level. This casts significant doubt on whether Brown's bullets could have caused the wound. Another piece of evidence is the timing of von Richthofen's final actions. If Brown's burst had hit the Baron squarely through the chest, piercing his heart or lungs, von Richthofen would likely have lost consciousness almost instantly. He would have been unable to continue a controlled chase for as long as he did. Medical experts note that a wound through the heart or major vessels would have incapacitated the pilot within 20 seconds at most. This suggests that Brown's fire did not immediately end the Baron, and that the mortal wound was inflicted at the very end of the pursuit. That timeline better fits the accounts of the Australian gunners, who fired on the triplane just before it went into its fatal dive. The ballistic trajectory evidence aligns most neatly with Sergeant Popkin's firing position. Popkin's second burst was aimed at von Richthofen's right side as the triplane was turning away, which means his Vickers machine gun was shooting upward relative to the plane. That corresponds to the upward bullet path found in the body. That said, in theory, an unknown infantry rifleman on the ground could also have fired the shot from Richthofen's right flank. Several riflemen did take shots at the red plane as it passed overhead. This unknown soldier theory cannot be entirely dismissed, as any Lee Enfield firing the same sort of ammo could have caused the same wound if the timing and angle were just right. However, no specific rifleman ever came forward with convincing evidence, and the volume of machine gun fire makes it more likely a machine gunner hit the target. Given all the available data, most historians and forensic experts conclude that the shot almost certainly came from the ground, not from Roy Brown's camel. Popkin, being in the best position and having an optimal angle of fire, remains by far the top contender in the analysis of von Richthofen's demise. It's worth noting that the initial autopsy report back in 1918 didn't reach the same conclusion. The British surgeons who examined Manfred von Richthofen's body right after the crash believed that the bullet's angle was too steep to have come from ground fire. This led them to attribute the wound to Brown's attack from the air. This early assessment was accepted officially at the time, which is why Brown was credited. In hindsight, many historians consider that autopsy finding to be flawed, or at least incomplete. Others suspect that the findings of the British medical team at the time may not have been truly independent or fact-based. The idea that the Red Baron was shot down by ground-based soldiers likely wouldn't have had a similar propaganda effect as the greatest German aerial ace being bested by the RAF. Further, the Germans could have lessened the morale blow to their populace by claiming that the Red Baron hadn't really been felled in honorable aerial combat. Officially, the victory is still attributed to Roy Brown, despite significant evidence to the contrary. That said, even though it appears that Brown and the RAF didn't actually land the final blow, this isn't to diminish their role in the event. To the contrary, without Brown and company essentially putting the Red Baron in a checkmate position, Popkin or an unknown rifleman would have never had the opportunity they were presented. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Also be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. The Bosnian Pyramid theory revolves around the controversial claim that a group of hills in Visoko, Bosnia, and Herzegovina are ancient man-made pyramids. Since 2005, Bosnian researcher Samir Osmanagic has promoted these hills, especially Visotica Hill, which he calls the Pyramid of the Sun, as the world's largest pyramidal structures. According to Osmanagic, early Europeans built these pyramids around 12,000 to 30,000 years ago, predating known complex civilizations in the region. Although captivating public imagination and boosting tourism, mainstream archaeologists and geologists overwhelmingly dismiss these claims as pseudoscience at best. Supporters assert several key claims in relation to the Bosnian pyramids, many of which are extremely controversial. Supporters generally frame these alleged pyramids as evidence of a lost advanced civilization, potentially rewriting European prehistory. Further, many of these supporters are ardent Bosnian nationalists who are eager to rewrite European and world prehistory around their nation. Supporters' focus is around the main hill, the Pyramid of the Sun, which measures roughly 720 feet high, allegedly dwarfing Egypt's Great Pyramid. Proponents argue its geometric shape indicates intentional human engineering. Osmanagic claims the Bosnian structures form, quote, the greatest pyramidal complex globally, and were built during Europe's Ice Age period. Advocates highlight precise alignment of the Pyramid of the Sun to the cardinal directions, arguing this indicates deliberate architectural planning. They also note the pyramid's symmetrical shape and flat summit, suggesting human shaping. Excavations organized by Osmanagic's foundation uncovered stone slabs on hillsides, interpreted as ancient building materials or concrete blocks shaped by prehistoric builders. Radar and thermal scans have also reportedly detected organized human-made structures or tunnels beneath the hills. Proponents highlight tunnels in Visoko as part of a larger network connecting pyramids. Osmanagic claims these tunnels contain monolithic stones, carvings, and artifacts older than 15,000 years, implying a complex ancient construction. And keep that in mind because I'll be coming back to this claim specifically in a moment. Despite captivating the public, Osmanagic's claims fail to meet scientific scrutiny, according to experts. Geologists unanimously identify the Visoko Hills as natural formations known as flatirons, steep triangular slopes formed by natural erosion. Analysis by a local university confirmed the hills consist of alternating layers of conglomerate rock, sandstone, and clay, consistent with natural geological processes. Upon further examination from outside experts, the formation has been described as completely mundane. Additionally, the supposed ancient concrete is widely recognized as natural conglomerate stone by geologists who've examined it. Archaeologists emphasize the absence of legitimate artifacts consistent with a pyramid-building civilization. Despite years of excavation, Osmanagic's team has not found pottery, tools, bones, inscriptions, or infrastructure that would accompany monumental construction. Experts argue that such a structure, if it were actually what he claimed, would be ripe with all these findings. Further, many alleged man-made structures, such as stone blocks, slabs, and terraces, are natural rock formations, fractured into geometric shapes. Experts note that excavation methods may have exaggerated or artificially enhanced these natural appearances to mislead observers. Furthermore, reports emerged indicating that some quote-unquote ancient inscriptions were recent carvings. This suggests the strong possibility that evidence has been fabricated to fit the pyramid narrative, further undermining credibility. Notably, in the fervor to prove that these sites constitute pyramids, actual historical sites have been damaged. Given the prominence of Visosika Hill, which pyramid advocates claim is the Pyramid of the Sun, it should come as no surprise that it was used for medieval fortifications. Samir Osmanagic's team has been accused of having damaged this cultural heritage, while attempting to prove that the hill is actually a pyramid. This has naturally led to significant criticism from mainstream historians, who may otherwise have seen this as a relatively harmless, though pseudo-archaeological exercise. Perhaps just as interesting as the Bosnian pyramids theory is why this mystery has caught on to such a degree in Bosnia itself. The popularity of the theory can likely be partly understood through sociological theories that examine how societies respond to collective trauma and search for identity after devastation. Following the Bosnian War, which left deep scars on the national psyche and physical landscape, many people looked for narratives that could restore a sense of pride and belonging. The theory taps into a desire to rewrite history in a way that offers hope, resilience, and perhaps most importantly, renewal. One theory suggests that in the aftermath of conflict, communities are more receptive to alternative histories that promise a lost golden age. In a country that suffered immense devastation, the idea of an ancient civilization with advanced knowledge provides a counterbalance to memories of recent suffering. The Bosnian pyramid narrative becomes a symbolic reclamation of a glorious past, one that contrasts sharply with the recent horrors of war. This reimagined heritage not only creates a unifying myth, but also offers tangible benefits, such as boosting tourism and fostering local economic recovery. And to put this in perspective, this town that would have otherwise been unremarkable gets up to 200,000 tourists a year now. Nikola Tesla was a visionary inventor whose New York City laboratory was a hub of groundbreaking electrical experiments in the 1890s. By 1895, Tesla's lab on South Fifth Avenue had become the epicenter of his research into alternating current, wireless lighting, and early radio technology. The equipment and prototypes housed there represented years of work and innovation. All of that changed in a single night when a sudden blaze consumed the building, marking a devastating turn in Tesla's career. In the early morning hours before dawn on March 13th, 1895, disaster struck Tesla's lab. A fire broke out in the downtown Manhattan building at the South Fifth Avenue unit that housed his workspace on the fourth floor. A night watchman on duty had just been tending the basement furnace. When he returned to the ground floor, he discovered flames had completely engulfed everything. He exited the building and alerted the authorities immediately. By the time firefighters arrived, flames were roaring through the stairwells and the elevator shaft of the six-story structure. The building was also occupied by a steam fitter supply company, and the floors were soaked with machine oils that helped the flames spread with frightening speed. Firefighters battled the inferno for over 3 hours, but the structure burned quickly. The heat grew so intense it even ignited parts of a nearby elevated railway line. By dawn, the fire was finally controlled, but Tesla's lab was completely destroyed. The entire fourth floor collapsed into the stories below, burying the remnants of Tesla's machinery, tools, and notes under charred debris. When morning came, the extent of the loss was clear. Virtually all of Tesla's inventions, equipment, and research notes had been reduced to ashes. Priceless models and prototypes, including those Tesla had displayed at the 1893 World's Fair, were gone. Tesla was crushed by this sudden ruin. Witnesses say he paced in front of the smoldering wreckage in disbelief and grief. Financially, the fire was a severe blow. Tesla estimated at least $50,000 in damage to his work, an absolutely huge sum at the time, and none of it was insured. The scientific community and the public responded with an outpouring of sympathy. Newspapers lamented the calamity, with one editorial calling the destruction of Tesla's lab a misfortune to the whole world. For investigators, the pressing question was what sparked the blaze. Official inquiries at the time were hampered by the complete destruction of the interior, but they determined that the fire started on the building's ground floor, well below Tesla's lab. All evidence pointed to an accident. The ground level and basement were work areas filled with flammable substances, making them prime candidates for the fire's origin. One likely scenario was that an open flame, such as a gas light the watchman left burning, ignited the oil-soaked surroundings. The blaze's rapid spread was clearly fueled by the building's hazardous contents. Investigators found no indication of foul play or sabotage. In their report, the fire was ultimately attributed to an unfortunate accident, a common hazard in an era of open gas lighting and combustible materials. Over time, several alternative theories have emerged to explain the cause of the 1895 lab fire. Some have wondered if one of Tesla's own experimental devices or electrical systems might have triggered the fire. Some modern theorists have wondered if a machine could have overheated, or a stray spark from a high-voltage coil could have smoldered and ignited something after hours. This theory, however, isn't backed by contemporary reports or evidence. Tesla and his assistants had left for the night, and the blaze, according to all evidence that we have, began on a different floor. Perhaps the most common theory is that the fire was no accident at all, but an intentional act by someone who wanted to halt Tesla's work. Tesla's breakthroughs with alternating current and his futuristic ideas made him a high-profile figure who some rivals or industrial interests might have seen as a threat. In this scenario, a competitor or disgruntled foe could have set the blaze on purpose to sabotage him. However, there is no proof of any such plot. The official investigation found no hint of arson, and Tesla himself never accused anyone of wrongdoing. Given their history of bad blood, Thomas Edison is frequently hinted at as the mastermind behind the fire. While it's entirely possible that industrial sabotage was involved, especially given the state of forensic investigations in 1895, there's simply no evidence to support it. Personally, I see the more interesting mystery here as not how the fire started, or if one of Tesla's rivals was involved. Rather, I wonder what sort of state-of-the-art inventions went up in smoke, and what exactly was contained in his lost papers. Given the exponential nature of scientific progress, and given that the fire happened in 1895, I have to wonder how much more advanced we would be if it hadn't happened. Well, I mean, it wouldn't be us, but the equivalent humans in the same situation.